So picture this. It's Monday morning, 9:47 a.m. I'm sitting in a fluorescent-lit conference room, and my boss just threw me under the bus in front of the entire team. Not subtly, not accidentally. He looked me dead in the eyes, smiled, and blamed his missed deadline on my lack of initiative. I felt it immediately. That hot, prickling sensation crawling up my neck. My jaw locked. My hands went cold. And in that split second, my brain did what yours probably does too. It started building a revenge fantasy. I'm going to send that email. I'm going to CC his boss. I'm going to expose him for the fraud he is. But here's the thing. Instead of doing any of that, I opened my phone and I read one paragraph from a book written by a Roman emperor who died 18 centuries ago. And that paragraph, those 12 sentences, changed everything about how I handled the next 30 days. Because I made a decision right there in that conference room. I was going to read Marcus Aurelius's Meditations every single day for 30 days, not as a spiritual practice, not as a philosophy project, as a survival manual for office politics, for the passive-aggressive emails, the credit stealing, the whisper campaigns, the meetings where you're talked over and then asked to take notes. I wanted to know if Stoicism could actually protect me. Not in a battlefield, not in ancient Rome, but in a cubicle farm with bad coffee and worse people. Spoiler alert, it did. But not in the way I expected. And definitely not in the way those motivational Instagram quotes tell you it works. So if you're stuck in a workplace that feels like a psychological war zone, if you've ever rehearsed arguments in the shower that you never actually had the courage to start, if you've ever smiled through a conversation while internally screaming, this video is for you. This is what actually worked. This is what didn't. And this is why most people who read Meditations completely missed the point. Let me be honest about where I was before this experiment. I wasn't a Stoic. I wasn't even particularly interested in philosophy. I was just tired. Tired of coming home from work and replaying conversations in my head for 3 hours. Tired of lying awake at 2 a.m. constructing the perfect comeback to something someone said at lunch. Tired of feeling like my emotional state was completely controlled by people who didn't even think about me after 5 p.m. And my office wasn't even that toxic, objectively speaking. Nobody was screaming. Nobody was openly hostile. It was worse than that. It was the quiet kind. The kind where your ideas get repeated back to you in someone else's voice and suddenly they're brilliant. The kind where you're invited to meetings you don't need to be in, just so you can't get real work done. The kind where just checking in, emails carry the weight of a threat. You've been there. You know exactly what I'm talking about. So I bought Meditations, the Gregory Hayes translation, because the internet told me it was the most readable. And I committed to reading one section every morning before work. Not a lot. Sometimes 3 paragraphs, sometimes a single page, but I read it with a specific question in mind. How do I not let these people destroy my peace? Not how do I win? Not how do I get promoted over them? How do I walk out of this building at 5 p.m. and still feel like myself? How do I stop giving people I don't even respect the power to ruin my evening, my sleep, my weekend? That was the real goal. And what I discovered over 30 days was that Stoicism isn't about becoming emotionless. It's not about being a robot. It's about something much more specific and much more powerful. It's about becoming strategically unresponsive. And that changed everything. The first week was the hardest, because I was reading Meditations with the wrong expectations. I thought Stoicism would teach me how to not care. I thought I'd developed this armor where nothing bothered me anymore. And when that didn't happen, when I still felt angry, still felt anxious, still felt anxious, still felt that urge to defend myself, I thought I was failing. But then I hit this passage, Book 4, Section 7. And I'm paraphrasing here, but Marcus Aurelius basically says, if something external is disturbing your peace, it isn't the thing itself, it's your judgment about it. And you have the power to erase that judgment right now. Now, at first, that sounds like toxic positivity, like just change your perspective, bro. But the more I sat with it, the more I realized something crucial. He wasn't saying the office politics weren't real. He wasn't saying my boss wasn't being manipulative. He was saying that my interpretation of those events was where the suffering lived. Let me give you a concrete example. Day 3. I'm in the kitchen making coffee, and I overhear two colleagues talking about a project I led. And one of them says, "Yeah, it was fine, but honestly, anyone could have done it." And they both laugh. Old me would have carried that for a week. I would have constructed an entire narrative in my head about how undervalued I am, how nobody respects my work, how I should probably start looking for another job. I would have brought that energy into every interaction for the next 5 days. But because I'd just read that passage that morning, I caught myself. I actually paused mid-coffee pour and thought, wait, what did I just add to that sentence? Anyone could have done it. Became, in my head, you're replaceable, you're mediocre, you don't matter here. But that's not what they said. They said it was fine and anyone could have done it, which might even be a compliment. The project was so smooth, it looked effortless. I didn't know their intent. I didn't know the full context. And most importantly, I realized I was choosing to interpret it as an attack. So I made a decision not to forgive them, not to confront them, just to curve, not add anything, to let the sentence exist as it was, without my commentary. And the weirdest thing happened. The anger didn't disappear immediately, but it lost its grip. It was like I was holding a hot coal, and instead of squeezing tighter, I just opened my hand. It still burned, but I wasn't fueling it anymore. That was week 1, learning that the war was happening in my head first, and the office was just the battlefield I chose. Week 2 is when things got interesting, because reading philosophy is easy when nothing's happening. The real test came when something actually went wrong. It was a Thursday. I got an email from a senior manager, someone who doesn't even work in my department, asking me to help out on a project that was clearly failing. The language was friendly. The request was framed as an opportunity, but I could read between the lines. This was a drowning project, and I was being thrown in as a scapegoat. If it failed, it would be my fault. If it somehow succeeded, the original manager would take credit. 6 months ago, I would have said yes, immediately, because saying no felt impossible, because I was terrified of being seen as uncooperative, because I had this deep belief that my value came from being useful to people, even when they were using me. But that morning, I'd read this line from Marcus Aurelius: how much trouble he has avoided who has not been led by the persuasion of others, but by his own judgment. And something clicked. I wasn't angry at this manager. I wasn't even particularly upset. I just saw the situation clearly. This wasn't an opportunity. This was a trap. And my own need to be liked was the bait. So I wrote back, and this is the exact email I sent, because I still have it. Hi. Name. Thanks for thinking of me. I'm currently at capacity with Project X and Project Y, and I wouldn't be able to give this the attention it deserves. I'd recommend reaching out to colleague. They have bandwidth and the right skill set. Best regards. Short. Polite. No explanation. No apology. No emotional leakage. And then I waited for the fallout. I was sure there would be fallout. I was sure there would be fallout. I was sure this would come back to haunt me in my performance review. I spent the entire afternoon bracing for retaliation. It never came. The senior manager wrote back a one-line, "Thanks anyway." The project continued without me. The world didn't end, and I realized something that almost made me laugh out loud at my desk. I had been saying yes to things I didn't want to do because I was afraid of consequences that didn't actually exist. That was the Stoic lesson of week 2. Not that I needed to become tougher, but that I needed to stop imagining catastrophes that were never going to happen. I was living in a future that I had completely invented, and that future was controlling my present. Marcus Aurelius wrote about this constantly. He called it troubling yourself about the future, creating suffering in advance for things that might never occur. And I was a master at it. I had a PhD in hypothetical disasters. Once I saw that pattern, I couldn't unsee it. Every time I felt anxiety about work, I started asking, is this happening now? Or am I rehearsing a conversation that hasn't happened, defending myself against an accusation that hasn't been made, panicking about a reputation I haven't actually lost? And about 80% of the time, it was the second one. By week 3, something shifted. And I want to be really precise about what it was, because this is where a lot of people misunderstand Stoicism. I didn't become emotionless. I didn't stop caring about my work. I didn't develop this Zen-like detachment where nothing mattered anymore. What happened was much more specific. I stopped confusing my reactions with my values. Here's what I mean. There's a famous passage in Meditations where Marcus Aurelius talks about people who wrong you, and he says something like, the best revenge is to not be like them, not to forgive them, not to understand them. Just don't become what they are. And week 3 gave me the perfect laboratory for this. There was a colleague, let's call him Derek, because that's not his name, who had made a sport of undermining me. Little things. Correcting me in meetings with a smile, forgetting to include me on important emails, making jokes at my expense that were just plausible enough to be dismissed as just kidding. And for months I had been playing his game. I was keeping a mental scorecard. I was planning my own subtle counterattacks. I was trying to outmaneuver him in the same arena he had chosen. But on day 19, I read this. It is possible to live well even in a palace, and the context matters. Marcus Aurelius wasn't talking about luxury, he was talking about corruption. He was saying that you can be surrounded by pettiness, manipulation, and moral compromise, and still maintain your own standard. So I stopped playing Derek's game. Not because I forgave him, not because I had some spiritual breakthrough, but because I finally saw that every minute I spent trying to outpolitic him was a minute I wasn't spending on my actual work, my actual skills, my actual future. I stopped responding to his provocations, not with cold silence that would have been its own form of engagement, just with nothing, with genuine indifference. When he made a joke, I smiled and moved on. When he forgot an email, I got the information another way without mentioning it. When he corrected me, I said, "Good point," and continued my sentence. And something fascinating happened. Within a week, he stopped. Not because I had won some psychological chess match, but because I had removed the board. See, people like Derek don't want to destroy you. They want to engage you. They want to pull you into their frequency. And when you genuinely stop responding not with performative superiority, but with actual disinterest, the game ends. This was the most powerful lesson of the entire 30 days, and it had nothing to do with being nice. It had everything to do with being strategic about where I invested my attention. Because attention is the only resource you can't get back. And I had been giving mine away to people who didn't even want it. They just wanted to know they could take it. The final week wasn't dramatic. There was no big confrontation, no moment of triumph where I stood on a table and quoted philosophy while my colleagues applauded. That's not how real change works. What happened was quieter. I started noticing things I had never noticed before. I noticed how often people at work were performing emotions they didn't actually feel. The performative outrage in Slack channels, the strategic vulnerability in one-on-ones, the carefully calibrated enthusiasm in all-hands meetings. It was like I'd been living in a theater, and suddenly someone turned on the house lights, and I realized I'd been performing too. I had been performing competence when I was overwhelmed. I had been performing competence when I was unwhelmed. I had been performing confidence when I was uncertain. I had been performing indifference when I actually cared deeply. And all that performance was exhausting. Marcus Aurelius has this line that I kept coming back to in the final days. Never let the future disturb you. You will meet it, if you have to, with the same weapons of reason which today arm you against the present. And I understood, finally, what he meant by weapons of reason. He didn't mean logic puzzles. He meant the ability to see clearly, to separate what is actually happening from what you fear is happening, to respond to reality instead of reacting to your interpretation of reality. So, in the final week, I started doing something I had never done before. I started being honest at work. Not brutally honest. That's just another performance. Just honest. When someone asked if I had bandwidth for a project, I said no if I didn't. When I didn't understand something, I said so without apologizing. When I disagreed with a direction, I said so without constructing a 30-minute justification first. And the world didn't end. People didn't think less of me. In fact, something unexpected happened. Some people started being more honest with me. Because I had stopped performing, and that gave them permission to stop performing too. That was the real gift of the 30 days. Not that I became invincible to office politics, but that I stopped being a participant in the theater that makes office politics possible. Now, I need to tell you something that surprised me. Something that goes against every Stoic motivational quote you've ever seen. Reading meditations didn't make me happier. It didn't make me love my job. It didn't make my colleagues better people. It didn't transform my workplace into some enlightened commune where everyone communicates with radical honesty and mutual respect. What it did was much more specific. It created a buffer between stimulus and response, and in that buffer, I found something I didn't even know I was missing. Choice. Before this experiment, I didn't have choices. I had reflexes. Someone criticized me. I defended myself. Someone praised me. I defended myself. Someone wronged me. I plotted revenge. These weren't decisions. They were programs running on autopilot. Stoicism didn't delete the programs. It just put a pause button on them. And in that pause, I could ask, is this the person I want to be? Is this the energy I want to carry? Is this battle worth my peace? Sometimes the answer was yes. Sometimes I did choose to confront, to push back, to advocate for myself. But now it was a choice, not a reflex, not a fear response. A genuine, conscious decision. And that changed everything. Because here's the truth nobody tells you about office politics. Most of it isn't about winning. It's about not playing. It's about recognizing that the game is designed to consume your attention, your energy, your sense of self, and choosing to invest those things somewhere else. Marcus Aurelius spent his entire reign dealing with conspiracies, betrayals, wars, and plague. And his private journal, which is what meditations actually is, isn't a record of how he conquered his enemies. It's a record of how he kept his mind intact while surrounded by chaos. That's the real lesson, not how to win, how to remain intact. I want to be honest about what didn't work, because this isn't a sales pitch for Stoicism. Reading meditations didn't solve my actual problems. My boss was still manipulative. Derek was still petty. The organizational culture was still dysfunctional. Stoicism doesn't change your circumstances. It changes your relationship to them. And sometimes that's not enough. Sometimes you need to leave. Sometimes you need to fight. Sometimes you need to fight. Sometimes you need to burn bridges and name names and make a scene. Stoicism isn't a substitute for action when action is required. What it gave me was clarity about when action was required. I spent so much of my energy on battles that didn't matter, on slights that weren't personal, on politics that were just noise. And by creating that buffer, I could see which conflicts were worth my life and which were just distractions. Also, and this is important, reading philosophy for 30 minutes in the morning doesn't magically protect you for the rest of the day. I had bad days. I had moments where I reacted instead of responded. I had evenings where I still replayed conversations and constructed imaginary arguments. But the frequency changed, the intensity changed, and most importantly, the recovery time changed. I used to carry a work conflict for days. Now it was hours, sometimes minutes. That's not nothing. That's not everything either. But it's real. So here's what I would tell you if you're in the same place I was. If you're exhausted by workplace politics, if you're tired of feeling like your emotional state is held hostage by people who don't even think about you after hours, if you're spending more energy managing relationships than doing actual work, Stoicism can help. But not the way you think. It won't make you untouchable. It won't make you immune to hurt or anger or frustration. What it will do, what it did for me, is give you back your attention, your energy, your sense of who you are when nobody is watching. And in a world designed to capture and monetize your attention, that might be the most radical thing you can do. I finished the 30 days, and then I kept reading. Not because I'm trying to become a philosopher, but because I discovered something I didn't expect. The person I was fighting in that conference room, in those emails, in those whispered conversations, wasn't my boss. Wasn't Derek. Wasn't the office culture. It was the version of myself that believed my peace was something other people could give or take. And Marcus Aurelius didn't teach me how to win that fight. He taught me that the fight itself was optional. That's what worked. That's what I'm still working on. And if you're watching this, feeling like you're losing yourself in the politics of a place that doesn't deserve you, maybe it's worth trying for 30 days. Not because it will fix your job, but because it will fix your relationship with yourself. And that's the only thing you actually control. If you made it this far, you're probably dealing with something similar. Drop a comment. What's the most exhausting part of your workplace? I'm reading every single one. And if you want to see what happened when I tried applying Stoicism to dating, that's the next video. Subscribe if you're not already. I'll see you there.